Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight. I'm Joss, the curator of the exhibition and organizer of the virtual event series, and it's truly great to have you all tune in tonight. If you haven't already done so, please check out the exhibition webpage after this event to view all of the works of Being in Between Being, from images to streaming videos to poetry. From there, you can also access the catalog. To begin, I first want to thank Mark Snyder and Dana Terrell, especially with today's opening. It is only through their help that this exhibition was able to have a virtual presence and be accompanied by a wonderful collection of writing. I also offer sincere gratitude to the catalog contributors and all of the fantastic participating artists. For partnership and support, I thank the UB Department of Art and the James H. McNulty Chair of English. Being in Between Being as an online exhibition and virtual event series was organized and curated throughout this year. Originally, as some of you may know, the show was to be in person in March, not have a catalog, and only feature 1 or 2 artist talks throughout an 8-week showing schedule. With the pandemic restrictions, I was hesitant to keep pursuing this project, but ultimately decided in July to embrace an online version. From August to now, the selected works and additional exhibition components have been rethought and recontextualized in many ways. Remaining most sharply, however, was an interest in what queer and transnational feminist work looks like and does. And starting from a place of blurred medium and genre, a space that relentlessly obscures categories and boundaries, Being in Between Being holds intertextuality as a lens with which to organically make manifest what often lies within gaps and exclusions. When in the context of queer and women identifying artists, this lens is accompanied by the weight of issues like nation-state violence, and the stakes are arguably intensified along with the artwork's power. With this virtual collection, catalog, and events, the aim is to illustrate the individual and collective techniques that assist in addressing interwoven modes of oppression, an address that can include resistance alongside rest, interrogation and creation, quiet dreams amidst bold celebrations. As mentioned, there are multiple events following tonight's opening. Tomorrow you can return using the same Zoom information at the same time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to screen and discuss 103 Shots, which is a very short film by visual artist Castles that responds to the 2016 nightclub shooting. Then this Friday, we'll hear from painter Sam Moyer-Cardos about their work on queer representation and use of voyeuristic gaze. After the new year, there will be 3 more events, so do take a look at the exhibition site and mark your calendars. It is with great excitement that I introduce Julia Rose Sutherland. I first met Julia when we were in a poetry workshop together. At the beginning, we started sharing ideas of what our end products might look like, what kind of chapbook we'll be assembling, etc. And Julia's response was something like, "I've just ordered synthetic human skin, and I think I'll inscribe words and maybe burn some words in the skin pages." I knew right then that I would be a fan of Julia's work and her methodology, and I'm so grateful that Julia could share her time and work with us tonight. Julia Rose Sutherland is a Canada-born artist who is a member of the Mi'kmaq Metepenagiag tribe. She creates interdisciplinary works, utilizing mediums like photography, sculpture, and performance. With this mixture, Sutherland navigates trauma and social issues associated with ongoing violence towards Indigenous populations in Canada. She addresses the systems of commodification, representation, and worth, as well as the identity politics surrounding Indigenous peoples of North America. With this, she fosters a dialogue regarding the treatment, representation, and voice of these marginalized communities. Often the work emphasizes concepts of loss and absence, alongside adapted Metepenagiag Mi'kmaq Nation traditional materials and techniques. Sutherland desires to regain a sense of identity and push to engage in more mindful conversation around subjects such as addiction and mental health, feminism, and Aboriginal identity politics. Through performative action, she engages traditional and spiritual methods, like the act of smudging and physical acts of exertion, to connect herself with the natural landscape and her spirituality. Please join me in warmly welcoming Julia Rose Sutherland.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to start this off by just thanking Joss for all the amazing hard work she's done, and everyone else as part of the show. I know with the pandemic and the COVID restrictions, everything has changed and morphed into a new monster, if you will, and has snowballed into something else, which I think could actually be the statement of resilience, especially of the art world and the DIY art movement. I think it's amazing. I'm just so thankful that you guys could be a part of it and that I could be working alongside all these amazing artists. And I'm excited for the next week or so to check out everything happening and all the talks. It's very exciting. I would also like to acknowledge the land that both UB as an institution lives on, and as well the one that I'm a guest on. I would like to acknowledge that I live on Treaty 7 territory, or the ancestral traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, the Pakane, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and Siksika, as well as, of course, Métis Nation, or Region Number 3. And I would like to acknowledge that the land is sacred, and that I would not be here without the elders and land keepers to hold this land and to keep it safe. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Buffalo operates on Indigenous territory as well, and of course, the Seneca Nation, the Tuscarora Nation, and the Haudenosaunee Six Nation Confederacy. And then to pose a question about land acknowledgement and where we're situated, to pose a question about what pillars of supremacy or colonization do you uphold, and to just question that every day, to think about where you're from, whose traditional land, who's taking care of that land, and how can you be an ally or a keeper of that as well. So without further ado, I would like to start my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen with y'all. And Jocelyn, can I just get a nod if it's working here? Perfect. So I wanted to do a talk today talking about protesting through traditional craft. As many of you may know, I'm an Indigenous artist of Mi'kmaq Metepenagian descent from Red Bank, New Brunswick. I've been focusing on craft for a long time. I have an undergraduate degree in craft and new media. So it's something I've always been passionate about, and of making, of course, too. This lecture will discuss the methodology of craft, an avenue to process anger, grief, loss, as well as an act of protest during a time of civic unrest. We're going to be covering an event that happened on Friday, June 12th, 2020, whereby my cousin Rodney Levi was shot twice in the chest and killed by the hands of an RCMP officer just off of Metepenagian Reserve land, which is sovereign nation land. And making work and talking about work today that is shown in the digital show that's entitled RIP Rodney Levi. And it's being showed in between being in between as a response to the police brutality of North America. In particular, I'm looking at Canada, Turtle Island, and the ongoing colonial genocide of First Nation people. I wanted to talk about media and how I found out about this news, or how our family found out about this news of Rodney Levi being shot. Misha Carnes wrote Dark Shimmers, the rhythm of neopolitical effect in digital media. And this addresses the way in which news, grief, sadness, and community loss, with a focus she was writing on the trans community in the United States, is perpetrated via social media, and how it is utilized by social media platforms to profit from this loss. But most interesting to me in this situation is the way it describes the interactions of effect via technology. She wrote, "This is too much. I didn't want to see this now. I often scroll past these posts when I am not in an emotional state. It is where I cannot handle them. I often feel numb, and when I see them, I sometimes think I slightly disassociate. Perhaps this is my privilege that I exercise, not to think about these violent acts until I'm ready. Or perhaps it's the survival mechanism, a form of emotional intelligence that I have built in order to withstand the repeated murders of my people and peoples close to me and my community and communities alike mine. Carda's personal insight hits the notion of effect on the nose for me. It tenderly touches upon the realities targeted communities face, the points of privilege, coping mechanisms that are necessary for society to allow such violence and hate to fester and to keep happening. As she states, it can be easy to push off, wait, scroll past these events in some respects. I think that people have become used to these stories, these news articles, these calls of help, and it begins to construct a narrative, a script of identity for these communities and marginalized peoples. With that in mind, I often question, something often on my mind when making work is, what does genocide have to do with me? And it's something I think we should all think about. Morel Miguel, with the aid of many others, wrote and directed a play called The Scrubbing Project, which contained a song titled The Genocide Song, or also known as the Genocide Blues, which goes like this: reservations, relocations, missionary education, subjugation and starvation, I put them in their place. Anorexic, diabetic, mutant child of tailings, or uranium excavation, epidemic and system incest, battery and rape, living with genocide, born into genocide, breathing this genocide, resisting this genocide. We're all doing the genocide's blues. Without knowing it, without a choice, I was born into the after effects of genocide, and I would say ongoing genocide. I come from strong women, strong people. In a letter my mom wrote my oldest sister on August 29th, 2008, upon her high school graduation, she wrote, "You have the world at your hands and it's so beautiful. You come from very strong women, your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, and so on. I can only imagine how they are feeling looking upon you now. I am so proud of you." Reminding us that we come from a long line of resilient, strong peoples. We come from wounds, we come from oppression, some systematic hate calculated moves made up of existential forces trying to exterminate indigenous bodies and marginalized bodies all around North America, and that women and two-spirited peoples in particular are strong and can overcome. The Canadian government has perpetuated genocide and erasure of Indigenous people by using tactics like sexual violence, intentionally compromising matrilineal family structures, holding statuses hostage from women who marry outside of social norms, forced sterilization that is still happening today, reproductive oppression, and don't forget the complete lack of resources, lack of repercussion for investigations into murdered and missing Indigenous women, as well as Indigenous peoples all across Canada. In this case, we're looking at my cousin Rodney Levi, and there's still no answers, or there's still no strong repercussions for what happened that day. I also want to think about the way that we're obtaining this news and we're seeing things. So as an outsider, not from the community, maybe you're seeing things like the storylines that I just posted that are talking about what happened. Also media displays that paint my cousin in a bad light, which is unfortunate, and it's also intentional. But I was seeing things from a lens of family postings on Facebook, which was so different because usually, you know, it's a call, it's a conversation, or you can be with your family at the time. But here I was learning about what happened via social media. And this time I'm not sharing something that just happened to someone in a community I care about, but happened to someone in my family. I've redacted the names of the people who've written these statuses, but this was shared on the day after and the day before and the day of the shooting. From the family, the pastor has always maintained that Rodney was invited. It was invited. The RCMP was there. We're spinning the story to state that he was uninvited. The family fully supports the pastor and his families who were traumatized by this, what they witnessed. And FYI, he'll be sharing in mass. So here, there's an example of just talking about right then and there, the miscommunication that was happening. At first, the conversation happening on mainstream media was that he was not invited to this and he'd shown up and was an endangerment. And that could not be more untrue. What happened to Rodney was senseless, but I would like to take a moment to talk about Rodney as a son, a father, a brother, an uncle, a friend, a man. He was genuinely kind and not just the type of man to hold the door open but a man who would help a complete stranger for no other reason than he needed his help. He was always had a smile on his face and made time for everyone. You never needed to ask him for help. He just showed up. And I think we could read this longer too, but I'm just trying to give an idea of sometimes how we disassociate or dehumanize these stories and these headlines. Sometimes we just look at the headlines. We're not looking at the person, not looking at the loved ones, not looking at the lived life experience. And I think that, again, is a tactic of mainstream media. And it's very unfortunate. I think it's also in the benefit of the RCMP, governmental systems of oppression. As I mentioned, it was a fatal shooting. He was invited by the pastor. And this was only actually 10 days after Chantal Moore, an Indigenous woman, was also shot and killed during a wellness check. During this talk, I want to explore a few ideas about craft and what craft can do, what it means to myself and other marginalized groups and Indigenous peoples of North America, and how it can act as an act of resistance or protest. Craft has been employed as an act of resistance and social change for a long time. Currently, we're living in a moment of, I would say, post-craftivism movement. I'm sure many of us have seen this, whether you're on a social media platform and it's coming up on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok is a thing now. As Athena Black and Nicole Bershman wrote, craft hard, die free. And I believe that that's such a beautiful statement. The politicization of craft in the present moment raises serious questions of precedent, of potency, and is always in the matter of which craft does, of identity. And I'm talking about identity in a very particular way. So I'm talking about identity as culture. Identity is learned and passed on skill sets, as well as mentality, as well as links to ancestral beings. The rise of craftivism and other politically engaged art practices which value radical potencies and political craft activity rather than the finished end products shifts the traditional emphasis away from the polished, professionally made craft objects themselves and towards a more political and conceptual focus. It has an emphasis on this idea of performativity, mindfulness, tactical knowledge, skill sharing, which is so important. The DIY, and it's also an act of anti-capitalism and activism in many ways. It's something to think about. What does craft do? I would also like to prompt the question or the idea to take a moment to think about craft as we're living now. Who does craft? Why do they do craft? What is the history of craft? What does that mean to make something with your hands? To look deeper into that knowledge of tactility. To think about craft and Quill, for me, is to think about the flesh. Joss mentioned the chapbook I was thinking about making and using this synthetic flesh, but it truly is like the paper to me is this idea of skin, of flesh that's being prodded, poked, punctured, and used to display something. I think it's really important. How do we talk about extreme loss and pain and dismissal and erasure? This is something I think about a lot when making work. I think a lot because how does a community move past hate and marginalization? How do we reconcile with, genocide and without ability to mourn, cope, or even articulate that? I'm thinking of the way that I learned this news. I read it online. It didn't quite make sense to me. I was frantic about it. I was watching this video of my uncle Malcolm on a street, blocking a bridge, on Facebook, screaming and yelling, not really understanding what he was saying. And then it, finally reaching me. And I remember laying on my bathroom floor, just crying. And the first thing I said aloud was, "Fuck the police." And that's something I was really thinking about. Because I was exploring this relationship to trauma within my work, with, the substantial impact of the spirit and healing, the necessarily means of coming back to my own tradition, to decolonize myself, to decolonize stolen lands, spirits, and methods of being. I think it's so important. And so I started making this work, and I'm going to talk more about the work in a little bit, but I want to talk about the significance of quill work and why maybe some people don't know about quill work, and that's great. I'm glad to talk about it a bit today. It's a type of embroidery done with porcupine quills, and usually done on buckskin, on birch bark, usually made into basketry, chair covers, all these different things, into clothing. But it's like, what does this have to do with me? What does quill work have to do with me, other than it's ancestrally belongs to my people? What does that actually mean? So I just want to show this. This is just a clip, actually, a little clipping from the Mi'kmaq news from 1979. So why is this significant, I guess? This is a certificate of achievement. See this display awarded from the Mi'kmaq Arts and Crafts Society. Here are 6 women who got to do this 13-week lesson of how to do quill work. And you're going, okay, so what does that mean that this is happening now? But this is the first steps of decolonization that I'm kind of seeing or recognizing. In the fact that they're regaining a skill set or a tradition or past tactile culture, learned and taught by their people that had been taken from them. So here it's interesting. It says, quill work, craft workers, reignite, they're reintroducing this craft back into their lives. But something I think that maybe not a lot of people recognize or see is that it was illegal to practice these techniques or craft works. It was illegal to practice speaking languages of Indigenous descent. And often I talk about, and I'll mention this to pretty much anyone I talk to, talking about, learning Mi'kmaq. I feel really torn in a sense because I don't speak Mi'kmaq, although I am trying to learn. Language doesn't come easily to me, but I'm working on it. But I also think that in itself is a reaction or residue left from colonization. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not necessarily my fault that I don't know the language, and it's going to take time, but I want to do it. But for me, this is so important because this also brings up ideas of legality and policy that's been put in place for hundreds of years here in North America. And I'm talking about Turtle Island in Canada in particular here. Thinking about the Gradual Civilization Act and what does that mean? It was sought to assimilate Indigenous people. It encouraged the enfranchisement size and adhering to European concepts of private land ownership, which is so different than the way that a lot of Indigenous communities view land, whereby we don't believe that we necessarily own land. We would believe that we are caretakers of that land and that the land is here for us and asks nothing of us except for us to take care of it. So there's something to be thinking about that in terms of conservation. And then to think about how these policies change over time into the Indian Act, which is also hurtful. At some point, without an Indian status and a band membership to go along with it, Native people were not allowed to live on Indigenous sovereign land. But at the same time, then they couldn't vote for many years. So there was this push and pull. And of course, we think about, setups like residential schools. The last one closed in 1996, and that's within my lifetime. And it closed here in Alberta, is in Treaty 7 and the territory in which I live. So it's something to think about, like these traditions were taken away, stripped from us very intentionally to assimilate us, Indigenous people, to European standards, which is at loss because there's such a rich history here in Canada. I brought up this particular photo. This quill box actually lives in Treaty 7 territory here at the Glenbow Museum. And this was probably the first quill box I ever saw in my whole life. And it was here at the museum, provinces like hours and hours, like 33-hour drive away from its home, which is also something to talk about decolonizational acts of museums and institutions holding these artifacts. But this was the first quill box I ever saw. I think it was the most beautiful thing, this like naturally dyed, beautiful work of art. It seems so simple, so easy, but it couldn't be harder to make something of this caliber. Like, it's just gorgeous. And I remember seeing this and being like, wow, what is this? Also seeing this, I must have been like 8 years old at the Glenbow Museum, staring at these things through this case, wondering like, wow, this is amazing. Like it says Mi'kmaq, like I'm Mi'kmaq, and starting to like bring this correlation about who I am, what my identity is, and what is this saying, you know. I think it's something that's really important to look at. I was lucky enough, you know, to be introduced to quill work also by family. In 2009, for example, my grandmother and I took a trip home to Red Bank, New Brunswick to visit our family. And during this trip, we visit everyone. It was wonderful. Usually when I go there, it's during the winter. You know, the East Coast, Canada in the winter is not dissimilar to Buffalo, if anyone's from Buffalo over here, where it's kind of gloomy and sad and cold. But it was so drastically different and so beautiful in the summer. It was just wonderful. And I was lucky enough to have a chance to be, you know, introduced to quill work by my great aunt, Betty Ann Haddad, who still to this day does quill work. She's amazing. I was instantly hooked by this handwork. I've always been really interested in embroidery and craft. And at the time I was actually studying my BFA at the Alberta College of Art and Design in craft and new media. And I distinctly remember sitting at a small kitchen table with my grandmother, my great aunt, you know, with my family, just telling stories, drinking red rose tea, and learning to do quill work. And it wasn't until maybe a few years later where I started thinking about quill work in a different way, like how could I make something? So I started making my first like quill box. It failed miserably. It looks horrendous, but it really did like teach me something about this idea of like something that looks so clean and beautiful, and what does that mean? And you know, I think for me this was an amazing thing to be taught how to do quill work by my great aunt, because it was taught by this oral history about what it meant to her and what it was, and teaching me knowledge of how to do something with my hands and with her. I think it was, you know, a way that I felt really connected to my family and the women in my family. And the Mi'kmaq were known, you know, as the porcupine people because of the way in which they did this amazing job of using this material, which is unwieldy. I don't know if anyone has worked with a porcupine quill, but it's awful to get stuck in you. But it's also becomes this beautiful mystical thing where you don't know what it is. And to be able to use that as material is so beautiful. So I guess this leads me to the work that I did in response to Rodney Levi's wellness check gone completely wrong from the get-go. I started a 3-part series, which I didn't know was a series at the time, but now exists that way. The one says, of course, fuck the police. The next, defund the police. And the last, refund communities. And I think there's something to be talked about or said about creating work that's slow, that takes time, that connects you to something else. It changes as it goes. You know, this is interesting. The reason I decided to quill it in the first place is my sister was on her way to see me when I found out the news about Rodney, and I literally arrived 5 minutes after I found out. And we both had this breakdown together, and I felt very lucky to have her there with me. But she's a beater. I'm not a beater. She's very talented. She makes beautiful work. I just can't wrap my head around it, but I can quill. So her first instinct was, we need to do something with our hands, and we need to breathe and gain composure, and you know, we need to take ourselves out of this like manic state of grieving at the very moment to just be together, but do something with our hands. So we beaded together. But of course, it's not for me. So it ended up being me doing quill work instead, something I understood, something I really loved, something I was taught about, something that I think is inherently an act of decolonization in itself. It's an act of protest to say, hey, it's 2020. I can have the freedom and the ability to do this work now, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it in a way that tells these systems of oppression to fuck off. So this is the first piece I made. It's called Fuck the Police, which led into me thinking about, what does it mean to say that? You know, it sounds aggressive and it sounds mean in a way, but it's not. It's how I felt at the very moment. But what I really was meaning, what was I really thinking, is about a system at play of oppression, which led me to think about, no, defund the police. You know, and all this was happening while, you know, during this COVID quarantine, so much happening with Black Lives Matter, especially in the US. And so these conversations are already being had. And we're talking about this is there. And I'm just going, how do we not stop this? Or how do we not think about this in a different way? Like, what does that mean? And I think that the thought process actually happened too, in part by creating something slow, creating something in real time, creating something with your hands, looking at something and really thinking. It's meditative in a way, but it also allows you to have a room for contemplation. And so, of course, the next thought that comes from this is refund communities. What does it actually mean to, to say, fuck the police? What does it actually mean to say defund the police? Because what does that mean? It doesn't mean that money doesn't go anywhere, but it does mean that money should be reallocated to helping the people within that system, helping the people within that community, rather than destroying, oppressing, and murdering them. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing this. I think I went a little long, and I apologize.
Totally fine. Thank you so much, Julia. That was fantastic. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. If anyone has questions or comments, feel free to use the raise hand thing. I'll try to gauge with the gallery view too if we're using our in-person hands. I'll start us off. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to Julia, you talked about the numbing effect of mass media and then the political potency of craft. And I'm very curious how you would explain how craft prevents or works to interrupt this kind of numbing sensation, this pattern of complacency, and maybe in the particular context of quill work or in the larger context of the craft activism. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
That's a great question. I love it. Yeah, well, I think, today I was thinking about, the scrolling effect, this movement with our hands of scrolling now that we do on our phones or on a computer, the way that we're reading and ingesting material online. And I think how craft work in general disturbs that is by literally taking your hands back into your body and giving it back to yourself. There's something that's really potent, really beautiful about that, about making something and making something that is tangible versus, this like digital interface that we see. And I think that's why it's so numbing. I mean, like, we're sitting at home now. We're living in a pandemic. Like, it's wild. Like, we're living in 2020. It's a pandemic. It's only 2021. We're ingesting material at a new higher rate than ever before because we're at home, or because we're feeling the pressure that we have to do that. But what does it mean, or how does that benefit us in the long scheme of things of healing and to take this time? The beginning of the pandemic, I was thinking about, like, I mean, I'm against capitalistic constructs. I think it's not for the people. And I was thinking about how kind of beautiful it was that all these conversations were now being had by people within the different communities that aren't part of maybe the arts context, like people were thinking, like, why do I have to work a 50-hour work week? Or why can't I have a livable income or universal income? Like, all these questions and ideas were happening, but then it slowly turned into just like debate, hate, festering, news articles, too much coming at us at once. So it kind of was like this like beautiful moment where like people were making their own bread at home and like taking time to take care of themselves, to like the opposite of that, which was, it's a pandemic, no one cares, you need to be productive still, and you need to work, and you need to do more somehow, you need to display that, you need to be on social media, and like it became something else. So I think that that's what craft does, though. I think it disrupts that, but we have to allow ourselves to get to do that. And craft takes time. It's not something easy. It's like healing takes time, like the soul wound takes time to do. So I think that's part of it as well. Just to like sit with yourself and do something is so gratifying. And I think when you look at like trauma theory in general, it talks a lot about like taking back your body, but I believe that's what craft does in a way. It takes back your body by doing something productively tactile for yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a question, comment, response? Yeah, Gabrielle.
Well, first, Julia, thank you so much for your talk. I just took so many notes. It was so exciting to think, especially about craft as a way to kind of counteract what both you and Jocelyn just paraphrased as like the numbing effect of mass media. And just to think about the difference between encountering terrible, tragic news about your relative on the internet and what it is to bead with your sister, or to take the time to use quilling as a way of manifesting both grief and protest. So I just was really very moved by what you presented. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about your perspective on craft and identity. And when you talked about, you know, seeing the quill box in the museum for the first time, what that interface was for you, and then just the difference, or somehow that's interesting to me, kind of like what happens in the museum, which is a problematic space, and then what happens with your, I think it was your great aunt who actually taught you how to quill, and sort of how identity gets constructed somehow in there. I'm just interested to hear more of your thoughts about that relationship.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for your comments too. Yeah, so I think about this a lot, because I don't think that identity is like a linear pattern. Like you're born, and then like every year you suddenly learn a new step. Like, and it's just the way that the educational system is like kind of built, or like that we understand it. I don't think it's that way. I think it's rhizomatic, and I feel this is the same way in which I think about. And if somebody doesn't know what rhizomatic means, it kind of means like it's like a spore. You know, it just lands places and then grows, and it's like this tangled effect of things growing and doing different things, and it's connected to every other thing, but it doesn't have to live on a linear line, if you will. And so for me, that's kind of how I feel. It's like, okay, one day I saw this quill box, right? And I was like into the quill boxes. I was very into the quill work when I was a kid at this museum. Looking at it, I just thought it was really beautiful. But I've also had a love for art and for crafted items. So I don't know, but I remember seeing this thing and feeling deeply connected to it, even though I was in like a weird, sterile museum space. And then of course, years later with my great aunt, like I just remember like being, anytime I'd go home, you'd see the quill work. It's like part of everything. Like everyone has like a great medallion, you know, the things in their homes. My grandma taught us how to do like dream catchers, all these things. I was never connected to dream catchers per se, or beading per se, but there was something about quill work that I just was like mystified by it. And I felt so connected to that. In the same way that I feel connected to hearing, you know, Mi'kmaq honor songs. Like I'll start crying, you know. It's like a weird thing, and I don't know what that connection is, but I know it's very strong. Or it's like I was watching Anne with an E. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that show, like Anne of Green Gables. And I'm just like, so I like Anne of Green Gables. It's like cute. But in the last season of this new Netflix regeneration of it, you know, Anne meets a young Mi'kmaq girl who takes her to her, you know, family's tribe and where they live, and then she writes an article about it. But they're speaking in Mi'kmaq, and I'm sobbing because of that representation, because of hearing it. You know, like when I see videos of my young cousins speaking Mi'kmaq, like there's something that does that. I think it's the same feeling I have about seeing quill work or learning about quill work. And so I don't know how that constructs identity, but I know it's deeply a part of my identity. But I do know, you know, I think about craft a lot too. I mean, like when we're looking back, like let's talk about like anthropology, which is like, you know, could be problematic in many different ways. But this anthropological lens, you know, what's the first thing they look at in the history of peoples? They look at craft work to learn about peoples. And I think that's like a pretty astute observational technique to look at, like, are my peoples or your peoples or anyone's peoples, is to look, what's our craft like? And if we can't find that information, if we don't have that information, because also, you know, like in the Metepenagiag Mi'kmaq and many indigenous tribes, it's an oral passed down history of one teaching another, or teaching a group and being together. But when you literally separate families, which was happening with residential schooling systems, which is happening with the ongoing foster care system, which is racist in its own terrible ways and functions as residential schooling in my mind, but also, you know, just making it illegal to have these practices like the potlatch, making it illegal for cultural exchange to happen among groups of marginalized groups, and the potlatch in general, you know, banning trade and cultural transference of indigenous tribes of Canada, which was a large network that was in tandem, you know, like it all trickles down into something. And so I think that craft has a huge significance to cultural identity or to self-identity. Um, I don't know what yet that means to me, I guess. I'm still figuring that out. That's why I think it's part of my work right now and decolonization in general and thinking about that and does that mean, you know? And how to be unapologetically annoyed or mad with a system, you know, that is oppressing. I'm trying to, you know, like I think about this all the time. I just am trying to grapple with all of that. But I think that craft has a big part and big play in it.
Thank you.
That makes me think of, Julia, one of the first questions you proposed. What does genocide have to do with me? And so, what, you know, when I was trying to kind of answer, um, I just, I thought about historical narratives and like, what histories do I perpetuate? What do I promote? What do I reduce? And so now, and then just now when you're talking about craft, you know, craft as language, craft also as a history. And so that I just get this kind of, beautiful image of, you know, craft work, um, creating that historical record that, you know, has been lost or can be recovered or rewritten, or, you know, to compete with the kind of mainstream, what the Western anthropologist has deemed the record, the historical narrative. So I just wanted to share that quick thought that came to mind.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think about this, that kind of notion a lot too. Like in dismantling a culture, what's the first thing you get rid of? All evidence. All evidence is arts, crafts. Like that's the thing that is left there, that evocative object or that object that is lived in or been used. That's what gets destroyed, you know? And I think that, I mean, it's a great tactic of erasing something. You know, we also live in an age too where I'm like, we're on the internet. So like, how do things live on in that way too? I also think about like these Zoom calls and these talks. I'm like, oh, it's so interesting. Like now they're recorded, like they exist somewhere now, whereby before it did it. So it's an interesting time and monument document kind of conversation. Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you. Does anyone else, I'm gonna now go back out to the gallery view. Any other questions, comments, things to add before we end with Julia today? Well, thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate, again, you know, your time and being able to put this on your calendar. Thank you, everyone, for coming to opening night. Now the exhibition, it's alive, it's online. Go check it out, reread it, relook at everything. There's streaming videos, there's the catalog, just a whole bunch of stuff to explore. So I hope you enjoy. And like I said, tomorrow we have a short film screening and discussion. And then this Friday, we have another artist talk with a painter. And then after the new year, we've got more. So stay tuned. Please follow me on social media for the show, and do come back. It'd be wonderful to include your voices in future events. Take care.